As Europeans across 27 EU member states prepare to vote, the hard right is set to make significant gains. Far-right parties in 9 countries, including France, the Netherlands, Austria, and Poland, are leading in the polls. The votes could mirror a larger trend affecting Europe, as parties once considered fringe are becoming more popular and even ascending to power in countries like Italy, Finland, and Hungary. The implications of a rightward shift could be far-reaching, impacting policies on migration and the environment and many other issues. How is this rise of the radical right changing Europe's political landscape? And what's at stake for the rest of the world? Here to discuss this is Cas Mudde, political scientist and professor at the University of Georgia, and Marta Lorimer, a fellow in European politics at the London School of Economics European Institute. Thank you both for joining me. Cas, I'm going to start with you. Far-right parties across Europe are polling strong ahead of the upcoming European Parliament elections. How big of a rightward shift should we expect to see?
So the far right, in all its different versions, is expected to poll around 25% of the vote, so a quarter of the vote. And it depends a little bit on who you count and who you don't count, around 20% in 2019. So it's an increase of about 25%. That is quite significant. But it's not such a big difference if you look at the individual countries in the last national election. So the far right has been growing in the 21st century, I would say, more consistently than in terms of massive shocks.
Marta, across Europe, the far right has indeed surged in popularity. It's also entered into some governments. I mean, in the last few years, we've seen Giorgia Meloni, leader of Brothers of Italy Party, elected as prime minister. Geert Wilders, leader of the Party for Freedom, won the Netherlands election and has secured a coalition government deal. The far right has made gains in recent years in countries like France, Germany, Spain. What's behind this rise?
So there are several different reasons why the far right is on the rise in several EU countries, and these may not be the same for all of the countries that we are talking about. A general reason is, of course, that there has been a rise in concerns about migration, not just cultural concerns, but also economic concerns. What we have also seen are essentially better organized far-right parties, much more effective in terms of the campaigns that they have run. And we've also seen a progressive normalization of the far right, whereby other political parties that previously would have, for example, refused to collaborate with the far right have started not just co-opting their ideas, basically, but also including them in government coalitions as either as external supports or directly as partners.
Has this most recent wave of immigration helped to galvanize those other dimensions that you mentioned? In other words, is the kind of fear of this influx of outsiders making people make more pragmatic decisions about coalition building? Is it making people co-opt other people's political ideologies and branding? I mean, is this all tied to this kind of, I'll call it xenophobic fear?
I mean, it's not necessarily a particularly new thing. So already in the 1980s, Jean-Marie Le Pen famously criticized his right-wing counterparts for basically copying his ideas on migration. So it's not something that is particularly new and that is strictly related to basically the most recent migration influx into the European Union. What has certainly happened is that with the migration crisis in 2015 in particular, migration has become increasingly politicized. Different political parties have started talking about it. The media have started talking about it. They've started framing this as a crisis, which has essentially really led to treating it as such. And this is the way that, in fact, far-right parties have been talking about migration for decades now.
The far-right EU Parliament bloc, Identity and Democracy, which is led by France's Marine Le Pen, recently expelled Germany's Alternative for Deutschland party over comments that downplayed the crimes of Nazis. It's not their first time showing Nazi sympathy or associations either. But Le Pen's National Rally Party itself has a history of anti-Semitism, xenophobia, Islamophobia. Are factions of the far right trying to rebrand as less extremist to gain political legitimacy, right? Are they abandoning more radical stances, not to sort of have an evolution of values or ideas, but to just look more palatable to the public?
So I think overall, at the core, they don't. They still stand exactly for the same thing, which is by and large a monocultural state. They are still Eurosceptic in the sense that they want a Europe of strong nation states, but they do increasingly embrace elements of European integration, or at least of EU politics, because they feel that they can change the EU from within. And I think there are two processes going on. One is just kind of a modernization, which is partly a moderation. But the other thing is also that the mainstream has shifted strongly to the right on issues like immigration and to a certain extent identity, Islam, whatever it is. And so they look more moderate because the others have shifted. If you actually look at the key positions, the far right hasn't changed much. If there is one position on which they very recently changed, it is Ukraine, or more importantly, Russia. And you see that in particular with Meloni, who for several years sent congratulatory tweets at Putin when he got elected, and now is this staunch defender of Ukraine. And what Meloni very well understands is that if you want to be accepted in Brussels, you have to be anti-Russia and pro-Ukraine. And if you do that, then you're seen as serious.
Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party was founded by Nazi collaborators, and a number of these far-right parties becoming more popular in Europe have a deeply anti-Semitic history, and a number of their members still hold deeply anti-Semitic views. How do far-right parties manage to reconcile this tie to anti-Semitism with unwavering support for Israel?
So I think their positions on anti-Semitism, or at least particularly their attitude towards Israel, is in fact something that has changed over time. And that I think particular parties that have some aspiration to government one day, such as Marine Le Pen's National Rally, have kind of decided that essentially they're willing to support Israel because they would rather support Israel than support essentially any Muslim country. So this is their anti-Semitism has been superseded by their opposition to Islam. Which means that a party like Marine Le Pen has been desperately trying to build links with the Jewish community in France. Meloni, also, her party started, the predecessor to her party, so the Italian Social Movement and National Alliance, already started this process of speaking about the Holocaust. So it's something that these parties have been working on for decades. And as I said, since they've started focusing so strongly on their opposition to Islam, their anti-Semitism has been kind of swept under the carpet because there are bigger enemies to worry about.
Cas, what do you say?
Yeah, I think that anti-Semitism has always been a divisive issue. So anti-Semitism was relatively central among far-right parties in East and Central Europe. It was much less the case, and certainly not open, in Western Europe, but there were also various parties that simply weren't anti-Semitic, like Vlaams Belang in Belgium, and that were always trying to kind of get support from the Jewish community, particularly after 9/11, but also within certain circles of the far right, Israel was always held up as the ideal state, because they saw Israel as a Jewish state and therefore an ethnic state. And they would always say, look, we just want what Israel wants.
An ethno-state.
Of course, an ethno-state in their vision. And because particularly in the 20th century, like anti-Semitism was so defining of what was far right, that it was also strategic, because the argument was, look, we are actually in favor of Israel. We have nothing against Jews. So how can we ever be related to the far right, which at that point in time was National Socialism, for which anti-Semitism was crucial. But it is important that there are differences, because Geert Wilders, for example, is truly an admirer of Israel. There's nothing strategic about it. He's as staunch a Zionist as some Jewish Zionists are.
Spain's Nationalist Vox Party recently hosted a conference in Madrid that featured a number of far-right leaders, including Le Pen, Argentinian President Javier Milei, Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, and Portugal's Chega Party leader André Ventura. The goal was to unify far-right parties from around the globe ahead of these parliamentary elections. What's the significance of this coordination? Ultimately, does it advance their goal of consolidating and unifying the far right beyond Europe? Like, is that an actual, tangible, realistic, attainable goal?
Not in the very strict sense, because if they can't even come to one group within the European Parliament, which provides phenomenal financial and political incentives to do so, then it won't happen at the global scale. But what is interesting and definitely new is that we have far more pretty high-profile, well-bankrolled international meetings of European and of far right from Europe and from the Americas, including the Republican Party, which participates in various of these meetings, sometimes with Orban, sometimes with Vox. So it will help them, but this is not a populist international or a nationalist international or brown international, whatever term you want to put on it. But it is not without significance. I mean, after all, you have a party here which is barely 10% of the vote, who has the president of Argentina at his rally. So if anyone wants to argue, look, don't vote for Vox, they're irrelevant, they can say, look, but we have actually the support of the president of Argentina.
Marta, how worried should we actually be about this?
I share the sentiment that we probably don't have to be that concerned about a far-right international coming together and hanging out. I think a lot of the logic behind these meetings is PR. So it's really them showing, oh, look, we're great, there's a lot of us, we can work together. That doesn't necessarily mean that they can work together. This being said, I also don't think that we should be completely relaxed. Let's not forget that some of these parties are at this point in government. They are in governments within the European Union. They are going to be in the European Parliament. This does mean that they are going to be able to shape the policies of the EU going forward, particularly if the mainstream then decides that they, in fact, would really like to copy some of their ideas. So I think it's still worth being mindful of what parties we're dealing with. They might not form a nationalist international, but once you have a far-right party in government, even if it's just, say, in a place like Italy or Hungary or the Netherlands at this point, you should still probably be taking a very close look to what it is that they're doing.
Fair enough. Cas Mudde, Marta Lorimer, thank you both so much for joining me on UpFront.